Good morning, dear Intriguer, and welcome to Intrigue Outloud. On today's show, I'm joined by Intrigue co-founder John Fowler to discuss the future of the Wagner Group and the election last week in Zimbabwe. It's all coming up. Morning, John. How are you?
Hello, Ethan. Good to see you again. I thought you did a great job on the pod last week without me, which doesn't bode well for my continued involvement, but I'm very well. How are you?
Oh, doing great. I missed you. I missed you terribly, just so you know. I mean, you're completely...
Very nice to hear.
You may be
That's what I was
expendable.
wanting.
You may be expendable to the audience, but to me, you're as important as ever.
That's all I wanted. That's all I want you to say.
John, we got a lot to cover today. I mean, Unfortunately, we missed a massive week in global politics.
It always works out that way, right?
Always. It's just a rule. But let me just read you some headlines to start. They're all either from the 25th or the 26th of June. Here's from CNBC.com. Russian mercenary chief Prigozhin is, quote, dead man walking. From Al Arabia, Prigozhin may be assassinated in Belarus as Putin, quote, doesn't forgive traitors. And from Time magazine, how long can Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin survive? Well, John, last week we got our answer, didn't we?
We sure did. Did you say those headlines from what, the 25th or 26th of June? That's they all deserve awards, I guess, for predicting the future. But yep. Yeah, we sure got our answer. Well, I guess to recap, obviously the news for our listeners and then folks who listened last week will be aware. I think you covered this last week. But former head of Russia's Wagner Group, the paramilitary organization, Yevgeny Prigozhin, he was one of 10 people on board a plane that crashed under mysterious circumstances near or from Moscow, somewhere between Moscow and St. Petersburg last Wednesday. Now, as you noted, I think last week, the only information that we have comes from, Russian government sources. They said that they ran DNA tests and that Prigozhin was on board. It was actually him. So we'll go ahead and take the Russians at their word that he's dead. But let me tell you, Ethan, we're not going to take their word that they weren't involved in his death, right? I think they came out and said it was a unfortunate accident and they're investigating the causes of the crash. Immediately after the news broke, open source intelligence reporters examined the flight data, the stuff that's available online, and that showed everything going normal with the plane, nothing unusual. And then, boom, it started to lose altitude, which US intelligence kind of agreed with and said that it points to a bomb being on board, which I think is what we all widely assume.
So we're assuming Prigozhin was assassinated, most likely on the order of President Putin. First question here. I mean, I was reading those headlines from 2 months ago. Right. Why did it take so long?
Yeah, well, two things there, I think. We generally assume that Putin kind of knows everything in Russia and nothing goes on without his say-so. But I think there is actually a semi-plausible, I'm working hard here, but a semi-plausible explanation that Prigozhin was assassinated by folks in the military or the security services. As my very good friend Dmitry reminded me on Twitter, Prigozhin's coup attempt, at least what Prigozhin said it was about, was taking out the defense leadership, nothing to do with Putin. He wasn't challenging Putin. So I guess Defense Minister Shoigu perhaps could have done this, but it's not likely, but it's not impossible. But to your second point, I think I'm surprised that Prigozhin lasted this long, and I don't think anyone's upset or shedding too many tears for him, but it's a pretty quick turnaround from launching this mutiny to kind of being dead. I think 2 months, almost to the day, right?
So you're saying you think it happened quickly?
Yeah, I think I was expecting this kind of revenge to be served much colder than it has been. Putin's shown that he's happy to wait to get his revenge. He's killed or imprisoned oligarchs, double agents, spies, famously poisoning Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader. But he's sometimes years after they've done something to enrage Putin. Do you remember that case of the Skripals in Salisbury back in the UK? I think that was like decades after Sergei Skripal was
father-daughter, right?
Exactly right. I mean, that was decades since he was working for the UK, and then like a decade since he'd settled in the UK before Putin got to him. So I am a little surprised. And in this case, Prigozhin goes from one of the big leaders of the Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to staging this mutiny, then seemingly shaking hands again with Putin in the Kremlin and shaking hands and taking selfies with African leaders at that summit that they hosted in St. Petersburg, seemingly filming videos in North Africa last week to being blown out of the sky on Wednesday. That's all happened in about the same time frame as it takes me to unpack after a 3-day weekend.
All right, so why now? I mean, I have to think Putin will understand that no one will think this was anything but an assassination. Does he not care, or is there a reason why he picked the end of August, just to spare Prigozhin from a long winter?
That'd be nice, wouldn't it? Save him one last Russian winter. But no, yeah, I don't think Putin gives a hoot about the optics anymore. I don't think he cares what people in the West say about him or think about him. I suspect part of Putin's decision to act what I think is quite quickly was just how brazen and public-facing the mutiny or the coup attempt was, right? I don't think Putin had any interest in tolerating that and kind of reintegrating Prigozhin into Russian society to kill him in 3-4 years' time. But what's, I think, really remarkable here is that Prigozhin obviously felt pretty comfortable, pretty safe, certainly safe enough to operate within Russia, board planes without, screening them for bombs. I think truly everyone was expecting that there would be retribution except for Prigozhin himself, which is just weird. So I don't know. There's a ton of unanswered questions around this. Prigozhin understands the landscape in Russia. He worked for Putin. He knows that Putin isn't likely to take it lying down. So I don't know. And I guess here's where I get a little bit conspiracy theorist about it. It's like, why would Prigozhin feel that safe? What deal did he strike with Putin? Did he have insurance, so to speak, some sort of compromise on Putin? Really speculation. But if that's the case, will that stuff come out in the near future? I think it's getting a bit into Tom Clancy thrillers, but I mean, all of this whole thing has been a Tom Clancy thriller from start to finish. So I don't know.
All right, let's take it back to the real world for just
idea.
A second and touch on something you said. I mean, Prigozhin was clearly quite popular among Wagner Group fighters, popular enough to lead them on a march, within hundreds of kilometers of Moscow. And let's not forget that this is still quite a potent force, and even popular among some members of Russia's military elite. So what's next? I mean, has Putin made a mistake?
Well, this is all speculation again, and Putin clearly isn't an idiot. I would imagine that he got his internal ducks in a row, so to speak, in the Kremlin before he felt comfortable making this move. Key power sources inside the Kremlin, he would have had to feel comfortable that those kind of key power players in the Kremlin weren't going to revolt if this happened, right? Let's not forget, this is a guy who has, over the last 20 odd years, managed to bring Russia's oligarchs, the military, their disparate security services. He's brought them all under his thumb. So, he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, but let's also not forget, Prigozhin's mutiny didn't happen in isolation. It was, I would say, fundamentally a response to not just the treatment of the Wagner Group, but how Putin has prosecuted Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has made plenty of people more than a little bit frustrated.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think you're absolutely right. As you said, and as I said before, there are plenty of Wagner fighters who really revered Prigozhin, for better or worse. Are they all now targets, marked men inside Russia? I don't know. Will they just happily kind of kiss the ring of the guy who murdered their beloved boss? There's a lot of unanswered questions. And of course, I think the thing to remember also as we talk and think about this is that, the way we view these events is potentially very different to the way it's viewed inside Russia. We don't trust Putin. We believe we don't believe what he says. We think he's a murderer, capable of this kind of stuff, has form, all of that. But perhaps inside Russia, and particularly among Wagner fighters, perhaps there's less certainty that Putin was actually responsible for this. Maybe he's able to actually pass off that idea that, hey, I'm not that sad the guy is dead, but I didn't kill him. I think Putin himself said about Prigozhin, I think he called him a talented man who made serious mistakes, right? So, maybe the Russians are actually buying that narrative.
John, for what it's worth, I would happily avenge your death if it ever came down to it.
Thank you very much. I'm a talented man who's made serious mistakes.
That too. Yeah, you're a bit hesitant to laugh at your own assassination. But John, what happens what happens now to the Wagner Group, or to those fighters that you just mentioned?
Yeah, that's the big question here, right? And I think the reason it's so up in the air isn't because just Prigozhin was on board this flight. It was like half the leadership of the Wagner Group. I think it was the other founder, Dmitry Utkin, and I think some of the security guys who were on board as well. And then on Saturday, just, 3 days after the crash, Putin ordered the Wagner fighters to sign an oath of allegiance to the Russian state, not wasting any time kind of bringing them under the thumb, which, that points to Wagner being subjugated into the Russian military, or at least into the Russian state somehow. But that's also just one possibility. Perhaps Putin will kind of maintain the Wagner Group and appoint someone he trusts as a loyalist to lead the group from now on.
I remember hearing about a former Putin loyalist who was tasked with leading the Wagner Group.
I know where you're going with this. Yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously, Prigozhin was one of Putin's kind of most trusted aides until he very spectacularly wasn't. And it just shows, it's a difficult question that Putin, or balancing act really, that Putin has. On the one hand, he doesn't want another kind of Prigozhin type to take the reins of this heavily armed, very well-trained sort of pseudo-militia group. But on the other hand, he probably wants to avoid upsetting the remaining fighters of Wagner Group. And we've been saying it for a long time. It's not a good idea if you're an authoritarian to have this extra judicial paramilitary group that's armed and well-resourced, because it's a matter of time before it comes back to bite you. But I think the lingering question here too is whether the Russian state will kind of replace the Wagner Group in all the places the Wagner Group has become so influential. We're thinking, Africa and elsewhere. I think until recently, Putin has been very, very reticent to get regular Russian troops into those places. There's this idea that you want some sort of insulation, a bit of like plausible deniability between some of the things that the Wagner Group is doing, which are, very, very questionable, to put it mildly. I think it was not even that long ago that Putin and Prigozhin denied there was even a Wagner Group and that they were even involved in it. So they clearly want that plausible deniability. If Russian forces start to move into Mali and Burkina Faso and these kinds of places where the Wagner Group is, well, they lose that insurance, that kind of insulation from criticism. So I don't know. It's a big unknown.
John, final word on this. I mean, we were taking side bets, not actually, but sort of jokingly.
Yeah, we run a side book. That's how we make money.
That's the primary revenue engine for Intrigue. But we were taking, sort of joking side bets about who would outlast who, whether it would be Prigozhin or Putin that would win the day. I mean, first of all, how does this affect the war in Ukraine? And does this mean Putin is ascendant?
Well, I'll take the first question. The war in Ukraine, we're still in this uncomfortable position. Ukraine's counteroffensive is ongoing. It's had some success, not a lot of success, but enough success to kind of keep pushing. I don't think Russia feels like they can, they don't have the situation in hand, but now they also don't have this Wagner Group to kind of throw into the battles, the meat grinder, as they so unceremoniously put it. So I don't think it's good for Russia's war effort, but it's pretty difficult to say how it'll play out on the battleground. As for Putin, and I've copped a fair bit of flack over the weekend for this one, but I think his goose is cooked. I actually thought that the minute that Prigozhin launched his mutiny, maybe even the minute that the Russians failed to take Kiev really quickly back at the very start of the invasion in 2022. But, everything that I understand about history and geopolitics and Russian politics and the way these things work, all of it points to this current situation to being a very unstable equilibrium. It can't hold. Putin is weak. Russia is weak. I kind of disagree with the people who say that the killing of Prigozhin is a show of strength. I think it's a desperation act. Putin will do plenty of things to project strength from here on out, but it might take years. It might not take years, but I think that we will all be talking about a Russia that isn't led by Putin sooner than many people think.
Today's show is sponsored by Incogni. Are you as tired as I am of getting phone calls from numbers you don't recognize? If you are, you need Incogni. Incognito steps in to scrub all your personal data, your phone number, your birth date, and even your social security number from the furthest corners of the web, places you wouldn't even think to look, so that the data brokers that steal and sell your data don't stand a chance. Check out the show notes to learn more. All right, welcome back, John. We love elections. There aren't many pre-scheduled events in global politics, especially none that are as impactful as elections can be.
Yeah, we do. We love pre-scheduled events, mostly because we can plan ahead and get a good night's sleep, right? And not react. But
seriously, yeah. I mean, for the love of God, if you're a world leader, if you're planning on doing something drastic, please do it before 10 p.m. on a school night.
Well, 9 to 5 would be nice. Not too much to ask, right?
9 to 5 is fine. We'll take what we can get. Well, so last week while we were off from the newsletter, we were closely watching the election in Zimbabwe. So, let's dive in. What made this election so significant?
This is the election between the incumbent Zimbabwean leader, Emerson Mnangagwa, a.k.a. the Crocodile, a nickname that kind of stems from his time as former President Mugabe's ruthless enforcer, so not the nicest guy in the world, and Nelson Chamisa, a former information minister in Zimbabwe, who was once the youngest person ever elected to Zimbabwe's parliament. We often talk about, the advantages that incumbents have in these kinds of countries in elections. They can lean on their experience on the campaign trail, their known quantities, and most importantly, they can use state resources to support their re-election efforts. But the advantage that President Mnangagwa, and I hope I'm saying his name correctly, but the advantage that he had in this election was, I think far more significant than just kind of the odd helping hand. So his party, ZANU-PF, that's the party that's been in power in Zimbabwe since the country ended its white minority rule back in 1980. Famously the party of former dictator Robert Mugabe, and he was in power until 2017, 1980 to 2017. And that was when he was actually ousted in a coup by Mnangagwa and his allies. And Mnangagwa was vice president at the time. And just like his predecessor, he's gone on to rule Zimbabwe as an autocrat and taken firm control of the country's election process. And we're kind of not that in much of a different place than we were under Mugabe, really. Yeah.
So was there any doubt that Mnangagwa, the crocodile, would emerge victorious?
Well, actually, interestingly enough, I think there was a little bit of doubt. In Zimbabwe's last election back in 2018, which was also contested by Chamisa, so it was the same runoff, Mnangagwa only won 52% of the vote. Not quite the margins you kind of see in autocracies, right? We're used to getting the 90%. And I think actually under Mugabe, he would win by 90%, right? Which is famously, you can just go like, oh, okay, obviously authoritarian, but it wasn't as clear in this case because 52%, well, that's pretty plausible, right? And this campaign was competitive. So there was hope, I think, that Chamisa might really have a chance this time around, but it didn't turn out that way. The election was marred by reports of hours of voting delays. There were allegations of voter harassment. Dozens of independent election observers were arrested and had their computers seized. So, again, that's very stereotypical authoritarian election tactics, right? And by Saturday night, Mnangagwa was declared the victor, again winning with 52% compared to 44% for his challenger.
So we started at this potentially hopeful moment for the country, or at least for ZANU-PF's opponents. That's been dashed. Those hopes have been dashed. Right. So where is Zimbabwe now?
Well, I mean, it's not a satisfying answer, but I think right where they were before. Zimbabwe is lagging badly behind its wealthy democratic neighbors like Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, obviously. Only 25% of Zimbabwe's population is employed, not 25% unemployment, 25% employment, and inflation is soaring over 100%. It's $18 billion in debt, so it's not a good economic story. And some of the country's creditors have promised to forgive some of that debt in exchange for political reforms like, free and fair elections, but they haven't come about. I think, interestingly, for the first time, several African blocs actually kind of criticized Zimbabwe for its failure to hold free and fair elections. I don't think that's going to be anywhere near enough to change this election's outcome, but I think instability in other parts of Africa is making Zimbabwe's neighbors kind of reconsider their more kind of live and let live, hands-off approach. at least to me, it appears that Zimbabwe has kind of operated away from international pressure, despite being, mostly an autocracy. So maybe that's going to change in the near future. I don't know. As interesting as a last word here on this, and I hate recommending other podcasts. You know that, Ethan.
Oh, don't do it.
Well, I feel compelled to here for the benefit of our listeners. But they may have heard of the Rest is Politics podcast, which is hosted by the former Tony Blair era spin doctor Alistair Campbell in the UK and former UK Tory minister Rory Stewart. But they had a very interesting segment recently on Mnangagwa and his kind of regime. Rory Stewart was a previous cabinet minister in the UK government, and he met him when he was on a trip to Zimbabwe soon after Mnangagwa came to power. And there was this kind of hope that he was going to be a reformer after Mugabe, but safe to say that Stewart kind of tells this story about how he left that meeting in absolutely no doubt about the ruthlessness of the guy and that there was going to be no change in Zimbabwe. So I think the idea that, external pressure is going to change things might be wishful thinking on our part.
I didn't realize that there even were other podcasts, John. And now I'm reading off of our description on Spotify, Intrigue Out Loud, your one-stop shop for global news.
Yeah, well, maybe we need to change that to like one-stop shop, except for the odd recommendation when we see it's appropriate. But don't substitute us for them. That's for sure.
And that's going to do it for me. By the way, we've got a great guest piece in the International Intrigue newsletter today from one of the top Middle East experts in the world, so make sure you head over and check it out. In the meantime, I'm Ethan Plotkin. See you on Friday.